lessons from Portal. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, my name is Jonathan Erhardt. I'm a BPhil student at the University of Oxford at the moment. And usually I'm not doing philosophy of PC games, so this is all relatively new to me. I did work as a game designer on two games called Public Enemy and Brainbread before I switched to philosophy, so that's where my interest comes from in philosophy of PC games. Today I will be talking about the reality and structure of virtual space, and my case study will focus on the computer game Portal. And my talk is structured as follows. First, I will give a short introduction into the role of space in computer games. Then I'll give a short introduction into the gameplay mechanics of the game Portal, and then have a look at two distinct questions concerning the space of Portal. The first is what I call the reality question. Is the virtual space of Portal real space? And the second, the structure question. If the space of Portal is real space, what kind of structure does it have? And in the end, I'll draw some conclusions from our considerations. So, space in computer games, or at least the kind of space I'm interested in, has usually the following role. Many of the games locate the player's avatar, NPCs, and the number of game assets, such as level structure and items in a 2- or 3-dimensional space. The player has usually a specific perspective to that space, either first person, third person, or some detached observer perspective, and sometimes a mix of them. In games like Counter-Strike, you first start with a first-person perspective. If you die, you switch to a detached observer perspective and sort of roam through the level as a bodiless spirit or something like that. And what is interesting is that this virtual space plays a similar role in the game as a physical space in the physical world. It is the background in which all objects are located. It determines the content of the player's spatial experience, and it plays an important role in determining which game assets causally interact with each other, but it is itself elusive and invisible. And in some of the more recent games, this virtual space itself has become an important gameplay element. And perhaps the most prominent example of games like this is the computer game Portal. It has been mentioned a couple of times, so I assume most of you are familiar with it. If not, here's a very short introduction. It is based on a prototype called Narbaculous Drop, which was a student's project at DigiPen Institute of Technology. It has been released in 2007. It is sort of a first-person puzzle computer game. It has been developed by Wolf Corporation, although the company did hire some new people, namely those people who developed Narbacular Drop. And it has very simple gameplay mechanics. Basically, there's only a single aim. You have to find the exit, and you have to get to the exit. This is not always easy. And the player has to make clever use of this device here, an Aperture Science handheld portal device. I'll just use the word portal gun or portal device for short, to circumvent and avoid a number of obstacles. Here's a simple example, a picture from Wikipedia. The player is on the left. He wants to get on the other side of the gap. How does he do it? He can't jump. The gap is too wide. Well, he can use the portal gun. What he does is he first aims at this place here, then he aims at this place here, and creates this sort of connection between two distinct areas of space. He jumps in there and moves on this trajectory, and because momentum is preserved through the portal, he'll use that momentum and move on that trajectory to the other side of the gap. As Gladys puts it, a character in the game, in layman's terms, speedy thing goes in, speedy thing comes out. That's how these portals work from a practical perspective. Let us call the game space of Portal, the way we've introduced it, VS for virtual space, and let us ask two questions about it. Is VS real space, and what structure does VS have? Let's take these questions in turn. Is VS real space? I think that sounds first like a very interesting and perhaps deep metaphysical question. And as so often, I think this feeling is due to the lack of clarity of the question and its ambiguity. I think this question is ambiguous in at least two ways due to the terms VS and real space. And I want to clarify these ambiguities before turning to answering the question. The first ambiguity is due to VS, the notion or the concept of VS, and here's the problem. Portal is what has been called a representational game. Representational games are characterized by two elements, a physical element in the actual world, which serves as a representation of a fictional element, the thing represented. In Portal, the physical element, or the factual element, as we can call it, is presumably bits on a hard disk, an image on a screen, a changing image on a screen. It might be difficult to say exactly what belongs to this category, especially if we're interested in the notion of space. So it's presumably not, the data of the whole game. Maybe it's just the data corresponding to the 3D engine, the 3D models, the distribution of the vertices, the lighting, all that sort of stuff. I can't give a precise characterization what falls under the extension of VS, and I think that's not very mysterious. That's just an ordinary case of maybe vagueness or indeterminacy of reference. The fictional element of Portal is a fictional universe, very much like our universe up to a certain point. Then a company called Aperture Science developed Portal technology. And some hints show us that it's supposed to be the same fictional universe as the computer game Half-Life plays in. And now we can ask whether VS is supposed to refer to the factual element of the game or the fictional element of the game. Here again, some of the candidates, if we settle for the factual elements, perhaps those elements of the data which correspond to the 3D engine and the spatial arrangement of vertices of 3D models of the game. Or it could be taken to refer to the space of the fictional element of the game, namely the physical space of the fictional world of Portal or Half-Life. In this paper, I'll only be interested in the first question. I take the second question, if we understand it in the second way, to be fairly uninteresting. If we take VS to refer to the fictional element, namely the physical space of the fictional world, I think the answer to the question is trivially no. As a fictional anti-realist, and I even think that fictional anti-realism is an analytic or conceptual truth, I believe that no, that space isn't real, because on any reading of the term real will at least entail existence, and fictional things don't exist, hence the answer to the question is no. So what I'm interested in is the factual element of Portal, data, pictures on the screen, the physical stuff. Then there's a second ambiguity due to the notion of real space. Here's the first way we could understand the question. It could simply be a cumbersome way of asking, does VS exist? Again, on this reading, I think the question is fairly uninteresting. We've defined VS as referring to the factual element of Portal, namely data, bits on a hard disk, stuff like that, and that obviously exists. So the second reading is the more interesting reading here. Is VS genuine space as opposed to merely something similar to space? Very much the same way one could ask whether something is real leather or artificial leather, which merely looks like leather but really isn't. So here's a more precise formulation of the question, the original question, 1 star. Is VS understood as a part of the factual element of Portal real, that is, genuine space? How do we determine the answer to this question? What kind of methodology should we apply? Let's first have a look at the artificial in artificial leather, an example where we have a firmer grasp on the notions. Artificial in artificial leather is an alienance adjective, which is an adjective denying or casting doubt on the applicability of the noun which it modifies, which is to say, the concept leather really isn't applicable to artificial leather. And I think real in this situation should be taken as an adjective which, in contexts where it's unclear whether something is the genuine thing or not, should affirm that yes, the concept following it, the concept which it modifies, is actually used in its normal sense. So, for example, if you have a career in organized crime, what you do is printing money, and at the end of the month, someone comes to you and says, here's your share of the money we've made. You might be asking, is this real money? Because you suspect that actually the guy is paying you with the fake money that you're printing every day. And he will say, yes, this is real money, affirming that the normal concept of money is applicable to what he's giving to you. So on this understanding of real, something is real space or letter if and only if it falls under the extension of the concept of space or letter. So now we have turned this whole thing into a conceptual question about the semantics of the concept of space. And I'll be using a special semantical theory of space, which has been called Spatial Functionalism by David Chalmers in his 2012 book, Constructing the World. But similar notions have been around for a while. On a blog post by, I don't remember the guy's name, he used the notion locational functionalism, which is fairly similar, and the idea itself arguably goes back to David Hume. Spatial functionalism gives the following characterization of the intention of the concept of space. The concept space applies to whatever plays the role associated with space in determining which objects interact with each other and in determining the content of our spatial experience. So it's a bit, it might be really complicated to cash out all these roles that space actually has in our thinking. That's why the notion of role appears in the analysis of the concept of space. But I think you all have a rough and ready idea what kind of items might characterize the role of space. For example, causal interaction doesn't work at the distance. Only if the space between two objects is zero, they interact. Stuff like that might be in there. Why accept spatial functionalism as a semantic theory? How could we find out whether this is the right semantics? I think we can use a method developed by Rudolf Carnap in a 1956 paper called Synonymy and Meaning in Natural Languages. And I'll make sort of an experiment with you. I'll confront you with a scenario and then ask you what the extension of the concept is of this scenario. This scenario is based on recent advances in physics. And it's a fictional scenario. What's in there is not true, but these can still be useful for determining the intention of a concept. So, suppose the universe, that's a picture of the observable universe, consists of two fundamentally different halves. Different physical theories are true in different halves. At the macroscopic level, you wouldn't notice a difference. If you travel from one end of the universe to the other, nothing would change in your ordinary experience. But if physicists do experiments and try to come up with a fundamental theory, they would actually find out that different theories are true for different halves. So here, perhaps some classical Newtonian physics turns out to be true, and there's the substantive space-time, which appears as a fundamental notion in the theory of physics. On the other half, perhaps some version of string theory is true, and space-time or space doesn't appear at the bottom level at the fundamental formulation of the theory. So suppose you start here, and you're going all the way to that area there. Macroscopically, nothing changes. You sit in your spaceship, you drink your drink, you eat your food. Would you say that around you space exists at the beginning of your journey, and would you say space exists at the end of your journey? So who thinks at the beginning of your journey you would say, yes, space exists? Seems fairly obvious. Of course space exists. Now you cross the border, everything seems exactly the same to you. The only thing which has changed is sort of the fundamental physical reality, and only elaborate experiments can show you that something is different. Would you say space exists around you, or would you say space ceased to exist around you? Who's for the first option? That's also my intuition. I think space isn't some ontological notion. It has been introduced for everyday purposes, and it still serves these purposes. And that's exactly what spatial functionalism tells us. Spatial functionalism tells us that whatever plays a certain role in sort of ordering interactions and causing spatial experience is space. And in one half of the universe, this has been substantive space-time. In the other half of the universe, some other fundamental physical facts have done that job, and they fall under the extension of space. So that's good. You seem to be, in the background, spatial functionalists. If someone is a spatial primitivist, he uses space in a different way. It is the view that the concept space picks out some fundamental space structure if it picks out anything at all. So on this view, on the left half of the universe, there would be no space, despite the fact that macroscopically everything looks the same way. And I think that's a fairly plausible semantical view. So now that we have a clarified question and spatial functionalism in our toolbox, we can proceed and try to answer this question. And I would like to give a qualified answer. First, let's consider a situation in which Portal is played on an ordinary LCD screen. Would spatial functionalism tell us that VS is real space? I think the question is no. VS may play some role in determining some elements of my visual experience. It may determine sort of the texture or the surface of two objects in my visual experience. And it may determine some of the causal structure in my visual experience, namely between objects on this surface. But it doesn't play the role that we normally associate with space, namely governing the whole causal structure of my perceptual experience and causing genuine three-dimensional visual experience. All I see here are two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional spaces. Now let's change the scenario to Portal being placed by Oculus Rift. It was great that we could test this yesterday. I didn't think this would happen anytime soon. I only saw videos of people using Oculus Rift when making the presentation here. When you use Oculus Rift, actually the whole visual field is filled with the game graphics. And in addition to that, you have a genuine three-dimensional spatial experience. So you can see depth, you can see what is close, you can see what is far away. And I think in this situation, it seems that VS plays exactly the role that physical space plays in your normal perception in your everyday life. It plays an important role in determining the content of your spatial experience. It is genuine spatial experience. It determines which objects in the game causally interact with each other. So it seems to satisfy the role we cashed out for the notion of space, and hence it falls under the extension of space. That simply means VS is real space. That's not some deep metaphysical truth or anything. All we had to do was analyze the concept of space and apply the semantics we found out to be true to that particular instance, and find out that indeed VS falls under the concept of space. Now, if we have established that VS is space, we can start to ask some interesting questions about the nature of VS. For example, we can ask some of the questions that physicists have asked about physical space. In particular, I'm interested in the following question: is VS Euclidean space even when there are portals at work in the game? Why think otherwise? Here's why. Suppose a very simple situation in which there's a room, you create a portal in front of you, and you create a portal in the back of you. What you see is something like this. You see yourself from the behind, from a perspective behind. And you can theorize about the structure of space given that spatial experience. And there's two competing hypotheses. One hypothesis is this here. What really happens is you have a perfectly Euclidean space, and these portals here, they work as teletransportation mechanisms. So you walk in, and the portal moves you from one place in the space to another place. And while you're halfway through the portal, what happens to you or your avatar is, it's a scattered object. It's an object occupying two distinct areas of space with no connection between them. And then there's a second hypothesis. This is my not so great illustration of it. What portals do, they turn Euclidean space into non-Euclidean space. And the portal itself sort of works as a Lorentzian wormhole, and if you move through the portal, you never become a scattered object. You're a continuous, normal object within the portal. Which of these scenarios is correct? There are two methods we could use for determining that. The first is sort of the traditional physical method, the stuff that physicists did when they tried to find out whether our space, the physical space, is Euclidean space. Well, you measure the sum of triangles and see whether it's something other than 180 degrees at some places. You measure the ratio of circumference and diameter of a circle. If it's something other than pi, then that's evidence for non-Euclidean space. There's two problems with this approach. First, there's the practical problem that we don't really have tools like that in Portal. That problem could probably be solved. And then there's the skeptical worry, which Hans Reichenbach and Rudolf Carnap have pointed out in the book Philosophy of Space and Time. You could always assume that there's universal forces at play in this universe, and these universal forces bend your tools exactly in such a way that they give you the wrong results and make you think it's non-Euclidean space, even though it actually is Euclidean space. Arguably, or admittedly, that's a skeptical worry. We don't usually think there's universal forces at play. But what's really cool about Portal is we can actually solve this skeptical worry, not like in the real world. We can namely have a direct look at some of the elements of the referent of VS, namely the data constituting the game. Does the code work with Euclidean geometry? We can have a direct look at that. Now, unfortunately, the source code of Portal isn't open, but there's a couple of interviews with people who have worked on Portal or know people who have worked on Portal. And they tell us that Portal uses a traditional teleportation mechanic with a velocity and orientation change. So this verifies the Euclidean hypothesis. And even though we may not be in a position to determine, to solve the skeptical worry for the actual physical space, at least in game spaces we can solve these skeptical worries, so at least something. So some lessons from Portal. The first lesson, Ledon Virta, I don't know how to pronounce these names, wrote that much influential scholarship on virtual environments is based on a dichotomous real world versus virtual world model. And one element of this model is the idea that virtual space and real space are mutually exclusive categories. If my argument here is right, then real and virtual space have compatible intensions and sometimes overlapping extensions. I'm using these notions, intensions and extensions here, and I've been ignoring some more technical details about these notions. When I'm talking about intentions, what I actually mean is primary intentions, but that's not important for the argument. If you're interested in this, we can talk about this afterwards. Then the second lesson, or actually it's more of a reflection than a lesson. It requires additional argument. We could ask, what kind of disagreement is there between someone who accepts and someone who rejects spatial functionalism? A friend of mine found my thought experiment extremely plausible. He claimed that, of course, there's no space on the other half, so he rejected spatial functionalism. What kind of disagreement is that? Well, they seem to agree about all the facts concerning candidate extensions of space. So their disagreement seems to be just about the intention and extension of the concept of space. And to me, this looks a lot like a merely conceptual disagreement. And what they could do is simply disambiguate the notion of space and agree that VS is space in one sense, but not in another sense. And which concept of space is prevalent in natural languages to me looks like a purely empirical matter. We should just do linguistics and empirical studies to solve that problem. And that's maybe sort of a deflationary view, but I think whenever we do philosophy, we should at least keep this option in mind. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Sorry, it was a bit longer.
Okay, thank you for this interesting argumentation, and got two points I would like to discuss with you. The first one is that I want to ask you if you think there's a difference between the proof that Portal is based on Euclidean geometry by the way that it's programmed or designed, and the player experience or the solving of the problem in that space. That would be the first question. The other one is the difference between using immersive tools in opposition to regular screens. Wouldn't that apply also to your space travel thing? Because you sit in that spaceship having a drink and just looking outside the window and not really engaging with that space. You're not immersed in that space. So I don't think that Oculus Rift makes really a difference.
Okay, the second question first. That's an interesting objection. So one way to solve this problem, that if you close your eyes whenever you're in the other half of the universe, then it doesn't cause spatial experience, and hence it doesn't fall under the extension of the concept of space. Perhaps we have to invoke counterfactuals here. I suppose if every conscious being in the universe dies and there's no spatial experience left, space doesn't cease to exist. So if we analyze the role of space, we have to be careful to introduce some counterfactual claims. If someone would, look out the window, then space would cause the right spatial experience. Something like that. I think if we characterize the role of space in a fine-grained enough way, using counterfactuals and things like that, then we could solve this problem. But the way I've done it is completely open to your objection. Yes. And could you repeat the first question? I wasn't sure I understood it.
It was just about the difference between the design and the programming of portal space and the solving of the problem on the side of the user. So doesn't the user have to think in a four-dimensional space in order to solve the problem? In an un-Euclidean space.
He at least has to entertain the hypothesis, I think. Yes, he has to see the two options and then make a decision. I think so, yes.
I think you touched on this, but I didn't quite understand it. It seems to me that the natural way to conceive space is studied by physics. And it seems to be, and then they make experiments, and they can have false opinions about it, stuff like that. And it seems to me that what they are doing is not a study of concepts. And they cannot discover with a space these properties without performing some sort of investigations. So you have two sort of levels. You have the study of concepts, and you have the study of the subject matter itself. And it seems, well, it's not obviously, but it seems like space is a natural kind, just like water. And you have a concept on top of that. And you cannot find the real nature of water by studying the concept. And that would seem to be the obvious, worry about spatial functionalism. It can address the concept, but not the real nature. And you seem to be making claims about the real nature of space.
Yeah. I think I would disagree with the claim that space is a natural kind. How do we find out whether something is a natural kind? Usually we use these Kripke thought experiments, these Putnam thought experiments, Twin Earth and that sort of stuff. And what I've shown here, this thought experiment about the universe with two halves, is actually exactly of the same kind. And people seem to agree that there's space on both halves. So people don't have the same intuition as in the Twin Earth thought experiment by Putnam. In this case, usually people say, in Twin Earth there's not water because there's only XYC, not H2O. And that doesn't seem to be the case here. People agree that there's space on both halves. And I think that's a sort of a semantical tool to find out how the concept of space works. Now, could there still be something like an ontological category of space at the bottom? Yes, I think it could. And I sort of build this into the right half of the universe. There is a substantive space-time. I don't know exactly what that would mean, but I wanted to build it in so I can keep it at the purely conceptual level, the considerations. And space seems to have semantics which are closer to that of the concept of philosopher, whatever does a certain activity is a philosopher, than those of water, I think, which arguably is exactly like that, the natural kind, the rigid designator.
Last question. Thank you for a very interesting and mind-triggering talk. My question is partly related to what Jon Erhardt was questioning, namely this, it seems as if you end up with a purely conceptual conception of the real. And I think I see a tendency in your talk in order to see that there is something more, but on the basis of this spatial functionalism, you don't have the tools yet. There's a lot to say here, but one thing I would like to pose more sharply is the following question: how do you relate the virtual space, and physical space compared to the conception of the real? Because I think there is a way of attaining a conception of the real in the sense of really pointing out the real without ending in any Platonic ideals or something. Because you might attach that to, for instance, the fundamental structure of orientation or directionality, which itself is not reducible to any descriptions or concepts, etc., of space. So it's neither an example of a purely conceptual approach to space or a relationalist approach or a substantialist. Neither is it a purely empirical approach. It is an approach that goes deeper in the sense that it touches upon the matter of the concepts themselves. So you know, it's a lot more to say, but shortly, how do you have any reflections on the relation between physical space, virtual space, and real space in this sense? In this sense, yes.
I think real is a concept which works in different ways, and I've had a look at one of these ways, namely as sort of an adjective which is the negation of words like artificial or things like that. But there is another way of using real, and sometimes if people ask, is X real, they simply mean, does X exist? And I take these concepts to be equivalent. Now, some philosophers have disputed that, but I'm Aquinian. I defend Aquinian meta-ontology. I think being real means to exist. And if we ask whether virtual space is real, I think we have to have these two potential reference of virtual space in mind. The factual element, data on a hard disk, and I think that obviously exists. We have hard disks, we have data on hard disks. Data are presumably multiply realizable physical objects, something like that. And then we have the thing represented, and there we could either think of them as, you know, some sort of mental fact, mental property a person has, then it's also real, or we could think of fictional objects as non-mental things, and then I'm a fictional anti-realist, and I think, no, they're not real, they don't exist. But people with different views on fiction would disagree with this last claim.
Okay, thank you very much.